Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEcon Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of our new report, produced in collaboration with Rhodium Group, Running Out of Road, China Pathfinder 2023 Annual Scorecard. It is the product of nearly a year of research and in-depth conversations with policymakers and economists from across the US, Europe, and Asia. This is the third year of the China Pathfinder project, and we believe the need for data-driven, nuanced understanding of what is happening inside China's economy has never been more urgent. Many around the world are finally coming to terms with the reality that previous editions of China Pathfinder have made clear. The Chinese economy has deep structural problems, and there are no easy fixes. In 2023, China's GDP will likely grow at less than 4% for only the third time in the past 20 years. And this raises fundamental questions. How will Xi Jinping respond? How will the other major economies around the world handle these shifts? And what does it mean if the world's second largest economy can't recover from its economic malaise? Will national security priorities continue to supersede economic dynamism? And how will industrial policies and tools of statecraft, like outbound investment screening from countries like the US, impact China's thinking? These questions become more pressing as elections approach in Taiwan and the US in 2024. This is where the China Pathfinder framework offers valuable insights. Now in its third year, China Pathfinder gives policymakers a way to distinguish the signal from the noise of Chinese economic policy decision-making. With the benefit of tracking changes in China's performance along more than 25 economic indicators across multiple years, we can move beyond instant reactions to identify where China is actually making strides toward market reform. We can also identify the areas where China is backsliding. The goal of Pathfinder has always been to create a shared language on China's economy for policymakers and economists alike. The reaction to Pathfinder in its first 2 years has affirmed that mission. In our meetings with US, European, and Chinese officials, the data we provide in these pages is recognized as useful and revealing, even if officials disagree on how to act in response. One of the reasons that the project has resonated is that the findings in Pathfinder are not limited to China. Because the purpose of the China Pathfinder study is to compare China to top 10 OECD economies over the same period, an interesting piece of this work has been discovering the trajectory of market economies over the same time frame, and we will discuss that today. Our hope is that Pathfinder sheds some light on the various paths China may take and shows that while Beijing has run out of the easy options, opportunities for adjusting the economic model remain viable. The course it chooses will determine its fate and impact the rest of the world's for years to come. So let's get to the new data in our new report, which is now available on chinapathfinder.org. It is my pleasure to welcome Dan Rosen, partner at the Rhodium Group, co-author of the report, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I got all the titles, I think, Dan. Dan, we're going to get into the data in a moment, but first I want to step back. What makes the China Pathfinder model framework different than other ways of assessing China's economy?
Josh, it's so great to be launching this year's edition. What makes Pathfinder special is that it takes a structural approach to understanding the Chinese economy, what makes it tick. And we've done that. We've built this framework up really over the course of a decade. Initially, taking that structural approach because it was the best way to understand why China's growth was so strong and so resilient to so many shocks. As the past decade has unfolded, it's now giving us a lot that we need to know to understand why there's such strong headwinds that China's dealing with. So it's a structural model of what explains a country's GDP growth.
So let's look at that structural model. Here is the new dashboard. As I said, chinapathfinder.org. You can find it. It's interactive. You can explore it. We'll share it in the link with everyone. But Dan, before we get into each grouping here, the framework, walk us through a little how we think about measuring the structure of China's economy.
If we're going to talk about an economy, a systemic view on what an economy is, whether it's market-oriented or not, we have to define what that means. So we got to take a lot of complexity that goes into what makes an economy market-oriented and simplify it down. We choose to do that here into 6 dimensions, 3 of which are kind of inherently domestic for China: financial system, market competition, innovation system, and another 3 that are inherently on the external side. They reflect how China's economy interacts with the world economy: trade, direct investment, portfolio. We'll get to those in a minute. But what's crucial in designing a structural approach like this is that the indicators have to be annual. They have to be available every year. They have to be comparable. We need the same data points for a selection of economies so that we can put China and the red line here in context of these 10 most advanced market democracies. We have an average in yellow, but we've got each of them in the background there too.
Sure, folks, here you can drop
give us
down,
the ability to do comparative analysis of what these systems look like, what makes them tick.
Okay, so let's go through each 6 briefly, starting with financial system development.
Financial system, well, first of all, what does that mean? You know, in between extra savings in your pocket and a company in California that is willing to borrow at a cost is the financial system. And the question here is, what makes it tick? How does that financial system work? Is it a planning office deciding how capital flows, or is it market forces setting interest rates, determining that kind of stuff? And when we look at our new data for last year on China, what we'll see, a little bit of forward movement for China versus 2010. It has come a distance toward market economy norms, but the amount of progress, look at 2021 over 2022.
It's a new feature we have this year, so you can compare data year over year, but as you said, just marginal movement.
As we do this year after year, we get more and more data points in time, so we can see the pace of evolution here. So a little bit of Chinese forward motion toward market economy norms, not very much. What progress there is mostly because one of our indicators for looking at financial system development is the ratio between interest rates and GDP growth speed. It should generally kind of be in the same neighborhood. In China, interest rates have been so much lower than GDP growth, that sort of implied subsidization and sort of mucking around with finance, and now those two are close together, not because interest rates have come up, of course, but because GDP has come down.
And that's what's a little bit of the movement.
In the text, you'll see a lot of discussion of what's going on there,
Okay, let's go to market competition.
Market competition is really at the heart of what makes our Western economies productive and efficient. It means that there's competition in the marketplace above all things. We make sure there's no collusion. We have authorities that are empowered to do that. So we look at this one and break it down. China, again, has made progress over 2010. For example, starting to get state-owned enterprises out of the game, making sure there's enough competition in most sectors, making sure private firms can get in there and compete, foreign firms can get in there and compete. But in recent years, most of those trends have also slowed quite a bit. And in the most recent year, we actually have a little bit of a dip this year, negative backwards movement in China's competition, market competition score.
You see that slight from 2021,
as you can see. And that has mostly to do with the role of state enterprises in the leading industries actually coming up in COVID conditions, private firms on the sidelines, state companies coming in to try to make up the difference.
Okay, let's go to modern innovation system. This is one of the key findings of this year's report. You'll see it in the text, and a significant dynamic here going on under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, we still think of China as really the most innovative place on the planet in many ways. So much technology deepening there for decades. But a little bit surprisingly, in our new year's data for 2022, we actually have a slight backslide in innovation. And as you dig into the indicators here, and look at why that is the case, why our integrated score for China on innovation has slid back a little bit, is mostly to do with venture capital as a share of financing activity in the economy coming down. So venture capitalists are the folks who finance the most innovative activity. It's not a bank loan from the bank down on Main Street. I just want to underscore
that point. Venture capital coming down into
crucial.
That hasn't been the China story in past years.
It's been a big driver of China's growth for the past decade, really. Most exciting place. Of course, folks are looking at government restrictions on venture capital flows to China from elsewhere in the world, but by far the main event in understanding last year's performance in venture capital in China is a domestic story of venture capitalists not knowing whether platform companies, high-tech China is supposed to be encouraged and open for business, or whether they're being sent to the political woodshed.
And here is somewhere where we can point out the other OECD economies we look at. You see China really in the neighborhood of other OECD economies here. I think Australia is one. Yeah, so very close to Australia. Spain is another. So this gives folks a sense of comparing China relative to other large economies.
You know, that's gives me a chance to point something really important out about the Pathfinder framework. Rather than just offer one line for what it means to be market-oriented, like if we just use the average for open market economies, we've got all 10 sort of shown in gray here to remind readers that there's not one size fits all for what it means to be headed toward market norms. There's a distribution of what that could mean. And in some cases, innovation notably, China is already on the edge of or inside the OECD range, right? So there's a lot that's to be applauded and, and appreciated about how China has grown in the past. The question is whether they're still making headway going forward.
And you mentioned where China is in the OECD range, and on trade openness, China is ahead of at least one OECD country.
I mean, trade is China's superpower. We think of it as a world leader in trade, and it is very much inside the OECD range for considerable time, even going back to 2010. They were already a good distance down the road. So China is not in last place in trade at all, and this year continued to see a forward step in the score that they get, especially relative to market economies in terms of trade.
So I'm going to try to do something now. We'll see if this works on the magic wall. We're going to go inside how we get this top level score. You can do this for any of the 6, but let's look at it on trade. So we hit explore the data, and we hope that this works and everything will come up. And then what we're going to see here, if we click on it, here we go, is the indicators that make up that top level trade openness score. And there are a series of them, but let's just talk about 2. Trade intensity on the economy for goods, trade intensity for the economy for services.
Right. So indeed, Josh, for each of these 6 larger dimensions, right, that we simplify down market orientation to, there are about 5 or 6 primary indicators we use to establish these comparable scores, right? There's also a bunch of supplemental indicators that people will find useful when they dig into Pathfinder online. But of these primary indicators, we're looking at trade here, you see that the reason why China stands at the top of the pack, you can see here in this visual right here, this is goods trade intensity, two-way imports and exports of good, right, as a percentage of global two-way goods trade. And China is far and away in the lead there. You can see in red in the sunburst visual.
The U.S. would be number 2.
And right, behind it, number 2 position is the United States.
And Germany.
Germany, and then everybody else is sort of, bringing up the rear there. So in goods trade, China stands out very clearly, and we all, understand very well why that's so important as an indicator for trade.
And then on services, a little bit of a different story.
Goods is not the whole story, right? I mean, especially today, thinking about where the value added is at the margin, where the growth is in global potential for trade, services plays a much more important role in many respects, right? And when we look at the services trade story in terms of who's in the lead, China is in the top third. Okay, that's a big deal, and that's a great improvement over 2010 where we're coming from. But we've got one other economy that is far and away the leader in
of course, the U.S.
trade, and it's the United States. Yeah. We're a services trade giant. That's financial services, cloud services now, and all sorts of next generation stuff that's happening for the U.S.
So I invite everyone, there's so much more here that they can look at within the indicators, but we just wanted to give a flavor of what you can see. I'm going to go back to the main dashboard. So Dan, as we said, we talked about trade openness. This is where China traditionally scores best on the way we measure this of the 6. But let's talk about the 2 where China has and continues to perform worse: direct investment openness and portfolio investment openness.
Yeah, so we're on the external side of the ledger now, and we've looked at trade, strongest point for China. These other 2 dimensions are cross-border capital flows, and they're 2 different flavors. The first, here in number 5 spot, is foreign direct investment flows. Foreign direct investment, we have a multinational company crossing the border, bringing its capital with it, and building something or buying an existing business of some sort or another. So it's real activity. once you build a factory, you can't just pick it up and take it home. It's a big vote on what companies think about the future of the economy they're investing into. And it also takes a lot of confidence for a national leadership to open the door and let their businesses go global and build things around the world. We think of China as kind of a global FDI, foreign direct investment leader.
This is one that surprises people.
And it does surprise people. And Rhodium has done other work on China World FDI for more than a decade now. And a lot has changed and happened. But when you consider what's normal for the advanced market economies in terms of FDI as a share of their GDP size, China is actually very far away. So yes, China has something to be proud of in terms of taking the first lap around the track as a nation that hosts direct investment and invests abroad, but really there's a long, long way to go before they're in the normal range of what it means to be an advanced economy and as a direct investor.
And even a longer way to go when it comes to portfolio investment.
Portfolio is tomorrow's possibility for China. Incredible potential, but when you think about it, China is really a very partial global economic power when you look at the portfolio investment lens here. We're looking at both outcomes, how much portfolio investment, by the way, as opposed to that factories and M&A, means buying and holding a security or a debt instrument, equities in a company. You bought them today, you could sell them tomorrow. So it tends to be fast moving. It's much in the aggregate larger volumes of money we're talking about than direct investment. And it's super important to defining who are global economic superpowers and who are kind of partial powers, if you will. And here, China's moved relatively little from 2010. Last year, we were effectively flat, almost no movement in that indicators for China. And we have really the largest gap with what it means to be an advanced market economy in the world today. There's a lot of profound reasons for that, which we do explore in the text, and I hope we're going to explore more here today as well. But you know, it's one thing to want to be a global financial player. It's quite another to make your exchange rate open and market-oriented, to make interest rates market-oriented, to bring down your capital account barriers. That's pretty tricky stuff to do.
Well, what you're getting at there, I think, goes to a broader issue and attention that Pathfinder identifies as what does China want? And portfolio investment is one way to measure that. There are different ways to measure that. But that's really what the conversation we're going to have now. How does China balance its foreign policy priorities, its national security priorities, its domestic stability priorities, and its opportunity for economic growth?
And what are we to think of that, right? Because there's a lot of different messages that we get from Beijing about intention to be a market economy, to play on the same field with other economies and portfolio flows and all these other things. But then we need a way to gauge that against some objective indicators and metrics to see whether that's just rhetoric or they're following through with it. Because which of those two outcomes happens is going to have huge implications for us and our economic policy challenges that need to be managed in Berlin or Washington or Tokyo or really anywhere in the advanced market world.
On that note, I want to thank you and everyone from Rhodium Group for the fantastic work and the collaboration that makes this possible. And I want to turn to our panel for their reaction. So have a seat, Dan.
Let's do it.
Okay, now I'm going to introduce our panel. We have with us Brad Setzer. Welcome, Brad. Council on Foreign Relations, Whitney Shepardson, Senior Fellow. Calling in from Beijing, Sun Yu, China Economics Reporter, Financial Times, and Nargiza Salidjanova, Director, China Projects Team at Rhodium Group, co-author and lead researcher on China Pathfinder project. Nargiza, Brad, Sun, thank you for being here. And Brad, I'm going to start with you. And the question's about spillovers. There's a lot of talk right now in the U.S. about what China's slowdown means or doesn't mean, both for the U.S. economy and more broadly for the global economy. Your take.
Well, I guess this gets at one of the difficulties with any metric that tries to be comprehensive, like the metrics that were presented here this morning. If you measure China's trade openness using aggregate measures of trade, China looks fairly open, more open than, for example, the United States, particularly on goods trade. But there's embedded within that single number a great deal of dispersion between China's exports, particularly of manufactured goods, and China's imports, particularly of manufactured goods. So if you net out parts trade, China's goods imports are now about 5% of its GDP, which is actually at the low end by a significant degree relative to the rest of the world economy. China's exports, again, netting out processing imports, are now more like 15% of GDP. I mean, in the middle range, frankly, of global economies, in part because some of the European economies score very high. But if you did a number like that for the US, we would be at the low end at 5. You average those out, and you say, oh, China's goods trade is 20% of total GDP, net of processing, but that misses the imbalance. And I think when thinking about how China impacts the world, the fact that China is a very modest importer now of manufactured goods is quite relevant when thinking about the direct effects of a slowdown in Chinese growth. To put it in concrete terms for a firm, once upon a time, Boeing sold a lot of aircraft in China. Once upon a time, Boeing might have worried that a slowdown in China would lead to less demand for 737s, 787s, 777s. But right now, Boeing sells 0 planes in China. So the net effect of a slowdown in China on Boeing, unless it leads China to reopen its willingness to buy Boeings, is 0. I think that's an important distinction. I think it is underestimated, and my one critique of the Pathfinder project is that it leaves out what I think is one of the most critical facts about China's economy, which is that manufactured goods imports today are well below manufactured goods imports when China joined the WTO. There has been deglobalization in China's manufacturing side on the import side. Now, that has the advantage of limiting direct spillovers to the US, to Europe, from a direct slowdown in China's economy like we've experienced. The risk on the goods side comes from the fact that China has relied over the past several years much more heavily on net exports, again, as a source of growth for making up weakness in consumption, potentially for making up weaknesses in real estate. And there is at least a concern that China may embrace policies that would support further expansion of an already large manufacturing surplus. There's a secondary concern, hasn't really played out in a lot of market pricings yet, that China's very large commodity imports might be impacted by the slowdown. And there, China actually is a really, really important market. Last aspect is on the financial side. China is a source of financial outflows to the rest of the world. It runs a current account deficit. Historically, that has had impacts on certain markets. When China was adding to its reserves, a lot of people thought that artificially held down Treasury and agency yields, had certain distortive impacts on US markets. When China built out the Belt and Road, it clearly had a big impact on those countries that were on the receiving end. Right now, China's state is not accumulating foreign exchange. Private money is leaving China, and the impact of that private flow outwards is A, harder to track, and probably a bit less distortive. So I think you have to think in some broad sense about where the risk lies, and to me, the risk almost entirely lies around a disruptive change in China's exchange rate policy that aims to propel Chinese exports forward and make up for internal weakness.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Brad. So if I hear you right, the first order effects somewhat limited if you think about exports and imports and manufacturing, but second order effects could be larger depending on how China reacts.
Correct.
Okay, Sunyu, I want to turn to you, and then Nargiza, I'm going to come to you both for a question and then a response to some of what Brad said. But Sunyu, a lot of the narrative here in Washington, and certainly something we've talked about with Pathfinder, has been China has to balance, it has to choose between its national security priorities versus economic dynamism. It has to choose between stability domestically and control versus unlocking and unleashing certain markets that could lead to growth. Is that how you are seeing the tension on the ground? And I know that it's not monolithic within the party, and I think it's helpful to hear your perspective on some of the divisions that are happening internally.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard, actually. Apparently, President Xi wanted to do both. He wanted to have both high economic growth and national security. And it's a fact that you can't really have security without a high level of economic growth. But at the same time, on the ground, it's becoming pretty tricky. To give you a few examples, one of President Xi's priorities was to achieve grain self-sufficiency in almost every province. So that means in many provinces, farmers were forced to turn their gardens or their, say, parks or other profitable produce into grain fields, which produces far less economic benefits as opposed to what they previously would have grown. And by that, China sort of was trying to achieve the goal of food self-sufficiency in almost every province. But that's in violation of the so-called common prosperity that President Xi was also promoting at the same time. And to give you another example, on the one hand, China is encouraging private companies, right, to grow. For example, the authority has been giving a lot of positive messages to internet giants like Alibaba or Tencent. But at the same time, if you look at the data, you see that in an area called cloud computing services, which Dan just mentioned, which Alibaba is still the market leader. However, Alibaba's revenue growth in this area was basically flat in the first half of this year. In contrast, the revenue growth for state-owned giants like China Telecom or China Mobile were respectively 63% and 80% in the first half of this year. And that's because Alibaba is now having trouble getting government contracts from the authority, whereas state-owned giants had much easier access because the government thought that by only giving contracts to the SOEs, you have a better sense of national security. So you see how difficult it is for the Chinese top leadership to achieve both goals at the same time.
Sun, thank you. And I think you outlined really well some concrete examples of where China has to deal with the choice and has dealt with it in one way, and certainly in the past few years. And now, at least there's some push to try to recalibrate, although we will see whether that actually develops in reality. I should have said at the beginning, thank you for being with us very late from Beijing. And I appreciate that. And any lags on the video, I'm sure, are due to those connections. But we can hear you pretty well. And I thank you for staying up for us and being part of this. Nargiza, I want to turn to you. One, reaction to Brad's comment about trade. I think that's an interesting point, and we should reflect it. We have another year Pathfinder coming up, so something we could incorporate. But two, the question that's geopolitical. How should the U.S. and the G7 think about a China slowdown? You know, Brad made the point that it won't have as much immediate impact, most likely, as some might think of the slowdown of the world's second largest economy. But there's an odd amount of almost cheerleading sometimes in DC that the fact China's going through economic struggles. But what does that necessarily mean from a foreign policy priority stance?
So that's such a great question, but also so incredibly complex, right? We can spend a whole hour just parsing all the different dimensions. But let me touch upon a couple of points that I think are particularly relevant here. First, and very importantly, when we think about so-called great power competition and how states compete and what is important for national power. Economic power is, of course, absolutely critical, right? An important calling card for China when it presents itself to the world and when it approaches developing economies is to say we are powerful, our development model is very attractive, we grow rapidly, we're able to provide, right, these incredible rates of growth. And that narrative is increasingly tested by the facts on the ground. We've seen a lot of adjustment, let's say, in retrenchment to how BRI works. We've seen China's own companies struggle a little bit as they're trying to hold on to their presence in China's domestic market while at the same time are facing a more tense environment abroad, right? So China was able to achieve incredible growth and success in part because its external environment was so welcoming, right? But as we see the tensions increase, that external environment is tightening as well, right? For the CCP and China's leadership, growth is an important part as well of how it presents itself to the world, sort of cultural legitimacy, right? Until very recently, it was sort of almost received wisdom that China is going to overtake the United States, for example, in terms of GDP growth. With the current trend lines, it's not likely to happen. And that is going to be an important challenge as well to this big narrative of China's inevitable rise, right? It's also a bit of an ideological hang-up where if you must double your GDP, right, by 2035, and you really can't do that, how do you achieve that? Of course, there are lots of tools that will help kind of nudge the numbers in the right direction, but that doesn't give you healthy growth. It doesn't give you robust growth, right? At the same time, all of the economies that are looking at China, the United States, G7 partners, other developing economies, look at China's growth and think, well, what sort of a country is it going to be 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? That is going to affect how policymakers think about these things. One final thought, and that is to do with China's own ambitions for itself, right? As we look at China and its growth trajectory when it comes to key technology development, right? Or its ambitions for achieving self-sufficiency or other targets, all these things cost money. And yes, there is a tendency to think of China as being incredibly, capable of just magically making things appear. That's not really possible. Like all countries, they have to pay for things, right? And in the conditions of the slowdown, they're going to face trade-offs. They will be able to afford some things, but not all of the different things. And the level of financing is going to vary because so much of how China pays for all these important achievements is through local governments, which are very much in trouble.
I'm glad you raised that. I want to get, and Brad, I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes on, we're going to talk debt, we're going to talk monetary policy, stimulus, all the levers China can or can't pull, or can but doesn't want to pull, and why they might do that. I want to engage the audience here, so askac.org on your phones, on your computers, anyone watching, submit questions, we'll get them to the panelists. Dan, I want to turn to you first. 10th anniversary of the 60 decisions, launched at the 2013 third plenum. And really, I think that meeting was so much of the genesis of the Pathfinder project and the idea to try to track China's progress or lack thereof toward open market economy norms. You're going to Beijing this weekend. What would you say to policymakers if they asked your advice, what reforms they should be pursuing to change some of the scores up here?
Yeah, well, and I'm doing this all the time, reminding them how positively a lot of analysts reacted to the economic reform design that Xi Jinping put on the table in his first year in office in the fall of 2013. What was crucial about that was that as an economy approaches middle income levels, it can't just count on demographic dividends or catch-up growth to continue to deliver very high GDP growth numbers. There needs to be a clear answer to the question of how are you going to deal with fiscal policy? How are you going to deal with the efficiency of the system, right? And the great news really was that the party put a program on the table that addressed all those issues. There was the question of whether it would be implemented, of course, but it had all the right elements in it, including the withdrawal of state-owned enterprises, improving governance in the corporate sector, fiscal policy reform. All these things and more were reflected in the party's plans 10 years ago. And even better news, they tried to implement most of that. We get to the bad news. By 2015, 2016, the transition pain and difficulty and adjustment and political liberalization required to fully implement those ambitions became too much to bear at that time. And so almost all of these crucial structural reforms that had been described by party leaders at that time have been deferred and have not been completed to date. So we have a pretty good idea, and we have evidence that folks in Beijing have the same underlying understanding of what it takes to sustainably generate economic productivity and efficiency growth in an economy. The question is whether they're ready to pay the political price and deal with the adjustment realities of putting that plan back to work this fall. Most people's reaction right now is that they can't imagine the Communist Party or Xi Jinping wanting to make another go at profound structural economic reform. And I understand that. I wouldn't look forward to that either. But what's the alternative? And that's where we get to the question of what is the potential speed limit of China if it doesn't do those reforms, right? We're at best right now making the case that the property sector bust, really, right, can be resolved with a kind of soft landing or without an absolute crash. But nobody's answered the question, what is going to deliver GDP growth above, say, 2 or 3% into the medium term and beyond? And I think even our friends at the IMF have some great misgivings about what the medium-term outlook is.
Well, okay, you laid a lot out there with the IMF. I'm going to get back to that because we have the WEO coming next week, and I want to get everyone's predictions on China revisions. But before that, Brad, I want to turn to you on something Dan said, because Dan's talking about the need for structural reforms. This is how China gets back to a longer-term, sustainable, higher growth path. Some have said they might have a shortcut through EVs, that they might be able now, given the growth in EV exports, to circumvent
Electric vehicles.
Electric vehicles, thank you. Yeah, electric vehicles. That they might be able to circumvent, some of the hard work that needs to be done through the growth of this market.
Well, it's genuinely hard to overstate how successful China has become at producing electric vehicles and now at exporting electric vehicles. China is poised to become the world's largest auto exporter. In part, that is because electric vehicles produced for the Chinese market have created a lot of excess capacity in internal combustion engines. And so China is exporting a lot of piston engine cars. But clearly, China is producing globally competitive electric vehicle cars. And in markets that are open, the European market is mostly open for now. The US market is essentially not. Chinese-made cars are gaining market share. And if you look at some of the economic decisions of major companies, Tesla seems very keen to make cars in China for sale in Europe. A number of other European companies, I think, have economic incentives. If you take away the politics, take away the risk of a policy reaction, to use the electric vehicle and the battery supply chain that is built up in China to produce electric vehicles to meet global demand. Is this a big enough engine to offset some of the other drags that China is facing? This year, it hasn't offset on the export side the very expected normalization of global demand for consumer goods. The US and Europe were both buying more toys, electronics, household appliances last year than they are this year. A lot of those came from China. We're buying less. There is a sort of cyclical downturn, and the EVs are offsetting a part of that, but not fully. So the quick answer is not yet. The bigger question is, can the strengths of the Chinese economy on the export side, and they're very real across all the clean technology space, Chinese industrial policies, not the policies I would say that the Pathfinder necessarily tracks or rewards, but Chinese industrial policies in clean energy have created an export powerhouse. China's domestic real estate bubble, the construction boom and now bust, is generating an incredible drag. And I think that drag, combined with the spillovers to local government financing, will far exceed any plausible estimate of the impetus from this very real clean tech export boom.
Can I just follow up on that, Brad? Please. And that assumes that there's not a global pushback on that spillover of Chinese automotive production into global markets even, right? Which, given the European Commission's investigation, the timer on that started today officially, right? I think there's a very real, there ought to be a very real concern in Beijing that if they don't deal with these structural problems that are holding back their domestic demand, they shouldn't over-rely on global demand to solve the problem of how to make all these investments productive.
Yeah, and Brad, we were in Germany together just a few weeks ago, and the Vice Chancellor talked about this, and then Ambassador Tai agreed with what the EU is doing. So to Dan's point.
Look, the Europeans are struggling to figure out how to reconcile their commitment to their WTO principles and the reality that they're putting themselves at a disadvantage relative to both the United States, which limits US EV subsidies to autos made in North America with batteries that meet extremely complex provisions, and China, which never allowed imported vehicles to qualify for its own EV subsidies. So Europe's the last open market. They're trying to, within the WTO rules, trade remedy response. I do think it is a caution, not just to China's ability to grow in certain clean technology sectors, but a caution on China's ability to rely even more on exports to make up for future drags from property. China's global manufactured surplus is 10% of GDP. It's up 3 percentage points from pre-pandemic. 5% if you net out goods trade. It's lower on the current account, but I think the current account is fundamentally misstated and inaccurate. And I wish the IMF would note this.
You have made this point.
I will make it again.
No, but it's
so many people say that the current account is the best measure, but when the current account includes adjustments of unknown origin that cannot be back-tested and make no economic sense, rely on the reliable, verifiable customs data.
Tangent, what does the fund say when you say this to them? When you make
The fund tends to emphasize the need to have an ongoing, healthy, constructive dialogue with the Chinese authorities.
Okay. Understood.
But there is a conceptual issue of whether an economy that actually did recover from the pandemic on the back of net exports can recover from a downturn also on the back of net exports without triggering strong reactions against its export model.
So, Sun, I want to bring you back in, and I want to talk about personnel in the finance ministry. You wrote a piece, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, about China's likely new finance minister, Lao Fan, and I'm wondering what you know about him, what your reporting shows about him. I saw in your piece I was interested, not a big macroeconomic background, so maybe we can share Pathfinder on this front, but I just wanted to know what you know, because we don't know a lot here in Washington, and I think there's a big interest.
Oh, sure. So Lan Feng'an had a pretty strong background in finance, but not on a central level. Instead, he spent more than 20 years working for local authorities in 3 different provinces. He did, however, start his career working as a junior staff for the Minister of Finance in Beijing for about 4 years. After that, he moved over to the southern province of Guangdong and working all his way up to become the deputy provincial governor of that province before moving over to 2 other provinces. He was known on the ground for being sort of low-key and sort of knowing what he's been doing. But what's most striking is that he was the deputy director of the Finance Bureau in Guangdong in the early 2000s when Liu Kun, the outgoing Minister of Finance, was then the director of Finance Bureau of the same province. So they too were once colleagues for a few years. And that's partly why Lan was picked as Liu Kun's successor. So policy insiders in Beijing mostly reckoned that there's not much initiative that Lan Feng'an would be able to take to sort of revamp China's financial policy per se. What he could mostly do is to perhaps discuss financial policies with his supervisor, which in this case would be He Lifeng, the vice premier, who is in charge of China's economic policy in general. He's now pretty powerful. To some extent, he's even more influential than Li Qiang, the premier himself. So the vision is that people like He Lifeng would be responsible for designing policies, and the finance minister, Mr. Lan, would be responsible for implementing policies to make it work on the ground. And that's sort of the trend going forward in a more and more centralized policy-making environment in China.
Sun, thank you. I think that's really helpful, nuance from you about what to expect. Of course, remembering where the finance minister sits within the hierarchy in China compared to other economies is also useful. And we look forward to the IMF meetings next week. I think he probably won't be there, but he will be at the next ones in the spring. So we'll get to learn more about him in those engagements. Nargiza, I want to bring a question from the audience to you. And it's about foreign firms and whether you see them, as the questioner asked here, jumping ship or not. I think Pathfinder sheds some light on this. We talked about venture capital as one dimension to measure investment in China, but there are a lot of dimensions that Pathfinder looks at to see where companies are or are not putting their money in China over the past year.
Yeah, I think the picture is quite nuanced there, but the data also can be quite stark. One of the indicators that we include under the direct investment openness cluster is actually looking at FDI intensity of the economy, right? And what we see for China is that its FDI intensity, which is the proportion of the FDI stock to GDP in 2022, was actually lower than it was in 2010. It's also a very, very slight increase from where it was in 21, but it's nowhere within the range of where we would expect it to be for an economy of that size. So just, as Dan said, China is a partial economic power, and foreign direct investment is an important feature of how China continues to acquire know-how, foreign technology, foreign capital, all those critical transfers, right, which have enabled so much growth. There's so many positive spillovers from foreign direct investment. But it's also an indication of confidence in the economy, of investor sentiment, right? And over the last couple of years, foreign investors have experienced sort of a shock after shock after shock. First was zero COVID, a lot of the policies that have tightened in the tech sector, for example. And then we look at things like governance over data and data transfer, right? Which for a lot of innovation, high-tech economies, sort of being able to transfer your data between different parts of your country's company is so important. And this is where a lot of the friction as well engages between open market economies, which have one set of regimes and policies governing data transfer, versus what China is doing, right? And for foreign investors, they're sort of looking at three different tracks, right? On the one hand, there are those companies which are still fully committed to their future in China, and they're strengthening their investment there. We have published a note called The Chosen Few that looks at European investment in China. And we see that for certain kinds of companies, mostly automotive, on the European side, there is a strong continued investment. But the proportion of investors is actually shrinking. So increasingly more and more investment is accounted for by a smaller portion of investors. So that's one track. The second one is the so-called China +1, where investors are protecting their presence in China, but they're also looking elsewhere. Some of that is driven by geopolitical concerns. A lot of that is driven by economic considerations, right? If you want to invest in China because you see the growth potential there, that's one thing. If you see it slowing down and you worry about what Chinese consumers are going to do and if there's a market for your product, right, you're going to try to look somewhere else as well. And costs in China are going up as well, right? So for Chinese companies as well, many of them are looking for more efficient, lower cost ways of producing, and they're trying to go abroad, sort of in the same markets in Southeast Asia, for example, right, that a lot of developed economy companies are doing that. And then there is a sort of a third category of companies, let's say, which are very quietly, because nobody wants to make a big deal out of this, are either cleaving off their share of the China business and sort of making that as a sort of a separate entity, or are quietly withdrawing, and nobody wants to make a big splash over that. But if you look at surveys by European, American, Japanese companies looking at their prospects for investment, many of them are saying they're either keeping it the same or decreasing it, right? Because they have so many different concerns, both on the economic and on the security side.
Thank you for that. I just, the question was about jumping ship, and I think you just gave such a nuanced answer that it's more complicated than that.
Well, there isn't a flood going out,
and
that's
I
for
think
sure.
What you said and what Pathfinder shows gets to that.
And we shouldn't, underscore, lose the fact that even as China slows down, it is still a big economy. It is still a very important global player, right? And companies are going to keep that in mind.
Dan, I want to turn to you and ask the question of what we get wrong. And one thing, if we were here a year ago, there was a lot of talk about the end of zero COVID, the end of lockdowns, and this is going to lead to a burst in Chinese economic growth, not just over a quarter, but over a sustained period. We didn't think that in the Pathfinder project, but that was certainly a conversation that was out there in Washington. What was the miscalculation there that Pathfinder revealed, the difference between short-term and structural?
Boy, I mean, I guess I would emphasize two things, Josh, in this. The first is that there are cyclical stories and sometimes shocks. COVID was a shock. The necessity of lockdowns, to a certain extent, was a shock on economic activity. And those cyclical factors are really important in determining what next quarter or next year's growth is going to be. One thing that China has tended to do over the years is to obscure those business cycles and other cyclical effects and deliver kind of steady as she goes GDP growth story all the time, which was comforting to investors up to a point. But now that we're sort of into new territory where it's no longer really possible to smooth all those perturbations out in the economy, it's confusing. And the impulse to tell a steady as she goes story versus the cyclical reality of what's happening, right? For consumption growth, household consumption alone, to have delivered the 5% story that Beijing wanted this year, household consumption would need to be growing about 15% year on year right now, which is just way beyond what's reasonable to have expected. So there's this kind of brave new world in terms of cyclical realities. And there is behind that the structural story, which, it's part of China's success of having gotten to middle income levels, that it's not reasonable to expect 6-7% GDP growth anymore, or even really above 5 any longer. Those numbers were delivered over the past decade by tolerating too much buildup of liability and inefficient investment in the system. And now the structural reality is that growth is going to have to be slower going forward. So all those kind of entanglements between the structural dynamics at work, which are long-term, and Pathfinder is all about offering folks a way to put that in focus, right? And this kind of new era of cyclical realities are the crucial first piece. I won't belabor the second, which is that, I think you have to say that there are acute problems with China's reporting of data over the past couple years, even more so than traditionally. And the limits of tolerance amongst analysts, including all of us here at this table, of course, to say that we're okay with that data has created credibility problems for Beijing that adds to the urgency of having this conversation.
Thanks for bringing that up. It's in the report. I think we flagged that this year, and something we'll obviously continue to deal with as we go through the Pathfinder project. Again, questions online, askac.org. Brad, I want to bring you in on this question we touched on earlier but didn't really answer. Dan's talking about the structural reforms that are needed, but why can't China do more in the near term on fiscal stimulus, monetary policy, to at least mitigate some of the slowdown?
Well, China certainly could do more. So it's at least in part, a question of why doesn't China do more? The answer may differ for monetary and fiscal policy. I think with respect to monetary policy, there's probably a twofold answer. One answer is that rate cuts inside China, which have taken place, are very much at odds with rate hikes, or now maybe high but stable rates in the US and Europe. And so further rate cuts would mean further pressure on the yuan, and President Xi has to ultimately make a decision about how weak of a yuan is consistent with the Chinese dream. Can you have the yuan is already basically at a 15-year low. Can you have a yuan that's at a 20-year low? Can you have a yuan that's back to the levels when China joined the WTO and be part of a country which is rising? Or does the depreciation of the yuan send a signal and also send a broader negative signal? So that's one constraint. The other constraint is, frankly, monetary policy. as used in the US and Europe, has never been a cyclical tool. It's a signal, and it frequently signals a broader loosening of regulatory conditions and a greater willingness to use quantitative tools to push money and credit through the system. But it is not simply a price signal. And there's just been a reluctance to go beyond where China has gone to date, but there is some use of the quantitative tools to push more credit to preferred sectors within a sort of fairly stable rate world. On the fiscal side, there's just, we in the US tend to think of fiscal policy as a single tool. Chinese fiscal policy is in effect multiple tools. There is a fiscal policy conducted by the local governments and their propensity and willingness to invest. That fiscal policy by local governments has historically been the biggest source of fiscal stimulus in China by far. And local governments are extended. The work of Dan and his partners has highlighted this. They rely very heavily on land sales for revenue. Their tax revenue sharing with the center is very limited, and they're in financial trouble. It is not obvious that they have the fiscal capacity or financial capacity to do stimulus. The central government hasn't actually done stimulus in the past. She doesn't seem to believe in stimulus from the center. It has a very clean balance sheet. Ministry of Finance debt is only 15% of GDP. Yeah. Central government debt is only 25% of GDP. You're number one in the G20 on the standard measures of fiscal space. But you didn't get there if you were always using your fiscal space at the center. And so there's deep reluctance to use fiscal space at the center, and particularly to use it to provide direct support to consumption. I think Ling Wei at the Wall Street Journal has nailed it. The simplest explanation for the reluctance to provide direct support to households over the last 5 years when the economic situation has called for it is that President Xi himself doesn't believe it.
So, Sun, since the Wall Street Journal was invoked, I have to go to the FT. It's only fair as to give the next question to you. But I want to ask your perspective on the ground where Chinese authorities are trying to attract Western businesses or not. Because I think there's some mixed signals here. You see big banks returning to certainly Hong Kong, but also Beijing. There are high-level meetings happening. You see some of these delegations. There's going to be a major congressional delegation coming soon that Senator Schumer is going to lead, a bipartisan delegation. So it seems that in some ways we want to be open for business signal is being sent, but then on the other hand, you see corporate raids, you see crackdowns happening on Western businesses. Your perspective from Beijing on this dichotomy?
I think that has to do with the priorities of different departments. Of course, the Minister of Commerce would be very keen to get foreign investments, that's for sure, as do local authorities on different levels. They have rolled out a whole range of policies, including tax breaks, cheap land, and even like free housing for foreign talents to attract foreign investments. But at the same time, given the fact that national security has become so prioritized, we are seeing departments like the Ministry of State Security, the police departments, the customs, the state prosecutors, tax bureaus, courts, or even the military starting to impose various kinds of exit bans for foreigners or staff for multinational companies in China. And I think that really sort of scared many of these foreign business people and multinationals in China. So it looks to me that basically the authority itself hasn't really reached a consensus on how best to treat or handle foreign investments in China. On the one hand, of course, China badly needs foreign capital and foreign technology to boost its economy and to to create jobs. But on the other hand, given the escalating tension between not just U.S. but also almost the entire Western world and China, I think President Xi, along with many policymakers within China, couldn't help but feeling insecure about the potential for sort of intrusion or infiltration of Western, not just Western sort of enemy, but even like Western thoughts into China. So that sort of creates some sort of policy dilemma, I think, that we're seeing right now.
Son, thank you. I think that you said that so well, that the authorities don't know exactly which way they want to go either, and you just see that reflected. There's not one consistent message being seen, and Western businesses are trying to parse out those signals just like everyone else. Nargiza, I want to come back to you because we talked, and Brad, I thought, spoke really succinctly about impacts or lack of impacts on the U.S. and then global economy based on how China's manufacturing sector is built right now. But what about regional spillovers? We haven't talked about that enough. Yes, maybe not as much an impact on the U.S., but what does China's slowdown mean for Vietnam? What does China's slowdown mean for other countries directly in its regional orbit, its #1 trading partners that are looking at this slowdown in a different way than we might be seeing it from the U.S.?
There are so many interesting dynamics there. And of course, impacts are going to vary and they're going to be uneven, and they're also going to be quite contingent on which sector you're looking at, right? But first, let's look sort of in the aggregate. China is wonderfully integrated into the Asian supply chains, right? And it's an important source of a lot of the components for a lot of these smaller economies, which have benefited tremendously from their relationship with China, right? And are therefore very cautiously watching what foreign companies are doing and sort of how the de-risking or diversification is proceeding. So on the one hand, these economies are poised, if they're able to capitalize on it, to really benefit from China's slowdown as companies seek better opportunities elsewhere, as they seek to take advantage of close integration in the regional trade, for example. There are important arrangements that have come online, although they're low standard, let's say, but something RCEP does important things to help facilitate some of the more regional trade. On the other hand, right, Chinese companies that I mentioned are not sitting still. They don't want to lose the advantage that they already have. And so many of them are actually increasing their presence in these markets, right? So they may continue to kind of leverage the same advantages that they have being Chinese companies, perhaps the same access to financing or some of the other benefits that they derive by virtue of having access to sort of China's industrial policy and all the different levers that can be pulled there, right? Which can cause a lot of friction with local companies. That can cause a lot of friction in local employment as well, right? And then let's also look at sort of the special category, which is commodities producers, right? And what we've seen is actually been quite interesting. Countries like Indonesia, for example, are restricting their exports of key commodities because they want to onshore, right, a lot of this production. They want not to be just the source of the raw material. They want the processing and all the value added that comes from having all these technologies, and it's very critical for the green supply chain race as well, right? The United States and everybody else is looking, and they're trying to find alternatives to China.
I'm glad you brought up commodities. IMF was here yesterday. They released an analytical chapter of the WIO, which I encourage everyone to look at, about fragmentation in commodity markets, trying to model out some of these impacts on US, China, but also the region if we go into a further economic block situation. I'm going to go out of order, so I'm going to come back to you, Dan, in a moment. But Brad, I want to go to you because there's questions here, and we haven't raised the word tariffs yet. You're a former senior USTR official, so I think we're contractually obligated to talk about tariffs in this conversation. We track this in China Pathfinder. You can see it in the trade indicators, looking at China's tariff rates, US tariff rates, other countries' tariff rates. US actually very high. I can't remember, Nargiza, probably third highest of the, China's the highest, US third highest. But sometimes that surprises people where US tariff rates are. Obviously, part of that is a product of what's happened over the past 4 or 5 years. But I want to ask you where you see policy going forward from the US perspective on tariffs.
Well, I guess no one should be surprised that the US now is one of the advanced economies with the most tariffs, for the simple reason that China used to be our single biggest bilateral trading partner. No longer is. I think Mexico is in first place. And we put significant tariffs on half of trade with China and modest tariffs on another, let's say, quarter of trade with China. So, and then there are non-trivial tariffs on steel and on aluminum together with enormous negotiated exemptions and exclusions to those tariffs. So the broad notion that the U.S. is now an economy with more tariffs than the advanced economy norm seems to be true. I think that reflects, for better or for worse, a judgment that I expect to persist that trade with China should be on somewhat different terms than trade with Japan and trade with Europe, which is a little bit at odds with the basic thesis of the WTO, which is that all members of the WTO, in the absence of a special free trade agreement, should be treated equally. So the tariffs are basically a reflection of a decision by the US that it doesn't want to treat trade with China like trade with Japan, like trade with Europe. There are tensions created by that policy. It is relatively easy to get around a bilateral tariff. We have reduced bilateral trade with China. We've encouraged indirect trade that uses Chinese components. In some strategic sectors, that indirect trade may cause concerns. But the most immediate likely evolution is well known, that there's an ongoing review of the Section 301 tariffs.
Still ongoing.
Still ongoing. And my sense is that there is a real desire to bring that review, which is legislatively required. It's a statutory requirement. I don't think the statute requires that you conclude the review.
That might have been an oversight in the drafting.
Or it may not specify that. It is implicit.
You just gave a message to Congress, although they have other issues to deal with.
But if you're going to conclude the review, you need to probably do it pretty soon. And I would expect and I would support a recalibration of the tariffs. Wendley Cutler has said, why not raise the tariffs on EVs?
Yeah,
fair enough. We happen to have taxes on imported EV battery cells at a much higher rate than taxes on imported EV battery packs. Essentially the same project. Should be taxed at the same rate. Permanent magnets made with rare earths were exempted from the tariffs because there wasn't production capacity in the US. The Department of Defense has now sponsored some capacity. You would think we could introduce some level of tariff there if we really believe this is a strategic project. And frankly, the tariffs on beds and bedding do not appear to serve an important strategic purpose or further American industrial policy goals. So there are probably some tariffs that could reasonably be rolled back. So I would hope that that's the outcome.
That's helpful, thank you. And it sounds like the signals have been maybe by the end of the year we get some clarification. So we will check back on that, but I think that's a helpful signpost to look for. Okay, we have about 7-8 minutes left, and I want to get back to the IMF issue you raised earlier. Next week, IMF World Bank meetings at Marrakesh. It's the annual meetings, first annual meetings on the African continent in 50 years. Atlantic Council will be there. We're doing a series of events there. Hope people tune in. We'll ask a lot about China's economy. We're interested in interviewing the Zambian finance minister, so there's a lot to talk about on debt restructuring. But the WEO, the World Economic Outlook, will come out Tuesday, so less than a week from today. I was surprised, Dan, that the IMF didn't revise down China GDP growth forecast in the July WEO update. They kept it north of 5% for 2023, and I think 4.5% for 2024. What do you expect next week?
Yeah, I mean, look, when the 2023 expectation of 5.2% for China was put on the table in January of this year, everyone expected China's recovery from zero COVID lockdowns to be somewhere between good and great. By the time of the mid-year revision, nobody expected the recovery to get anywhere close to hopes and dreams, and yet the projection for the year was not adjusted downward at all. It stayed at 5.2, although the composition of how they got to that number was altered a little bit, right? So that's concerning, right? A lot of other governments around the world and businesses use those WEO projections as a basic foundation for their expectation about global conditions. The reality for the fund, which is crucial to understand, as you point out often, Josh, is that the staff are required to use the data provided by the government of the People's Republic of China in calculating those projections. So their hands are somewhat tied, and they're not allowed to go off and kind of pick their own alternative data with which to offer a corrective. In the staff reports and papers that we get, including in the Article 4 process, we often see the staff, signaling their misgivings about the headline data that's going to be provided. But next week, and this is really part of the Pathfinder design, isn't it? That we have this thing coming out usually right before the fund bank, so that this work can be used and reflected upon in those meetings and consultations. I know you will bring this question to bear when you're over there. I think it's incumbent upon the fund to at least offer a more transparent explanation for how one can stand by the same GDP number at the end of 2023 that they started with at the beginning of 2023. Fine, they can say, but the way the system works is we use official Chinese numbers, but then they need to pass that question to the Chinese authorities who produce that number to please explain what is growing to deliver that, because I can't find anything that could possibly explain more than about really 2.5% growth number for the year.
Okay, thank you, and that's what we'll look for next week when this comes out. Sun, I have one more question for you. I'm then going to turn to the panel for final thoughts and what we want to look ahead when we do Pathfinder a year from now in the 4th edition of Pathfinder. But Sun, I want to ask you a question about economic statecraft. That's a key issue for us here at the Atlantic Council and our Economic Statecraft Initiative. We talked about tariffs, that's one part of economic statecraft, but there's been a range of tools the US has really accelerated over the past few years. And I'm thinking specifically, I mentioned in my opening remarks, outbound investment screening. And I just wonder, these tools, how they're perceived within the party in Beijing. Are we at a point post-Secretary Raimondo's visit where it feels like temperatures are cooling? Or are we at a point where China's wondering what comes next from the US?
I think for the US, it's always possible to sort of compartmentalize all kinds of policies, right? So the US could on the one hand do business with China, but on the other hand, impose all kinds of controls over different kinds of high-tech products on China at the same time. But for China, they're all together. So you either treat us very well, or you are our enemy. That's the thinking behind many China's policymakers. So which creates the issue, right? So China is very keen for the US to drop all these controls altogether before China is able to reestablish normal economic relationships with the United States. That's, I think, one crucial challenge that's lying ahead of between the US and China. Because for China, the idea is that you either treat us as a real friend or you are an enemy. So that's something that the Chinese leadership now is struggling with.
Sun, thank you. That's helpful to hear that. Okay, I'm going to go around to each of the panelists for final thoughts. And the framing question for this is, we're sitting here a year from now. We're 4 weeks out from the US election. What is the state of China's economy? Brad, I'm going to start with you with that easy question.
Well, I'll make the safe forecast that if we're 4 weeks out from the US election, we will only talk about how the outcome of the US election will impact US policy towards China and China's economy.
I will try to avoid that, but you're probably right.
Look, I think the baseline should be that the property downturn is a sustained multi-year drag on China's growth, that China is slowly restructuring its economy writ large for a world where some of the very good work of Rhodium has suggested China needs to build about half as many apartments as it was building before. That's a pretty big downshift in the biggest sector of your economy. It is a multi-year drag because pre-sales are still being built, as I understand it. But at some point, you'll complete the stock of pre-sales, and you'll be adjusting down to a level of housing construction that is based off the current level of real new starts. And that's a lot lower level. So the drag is persistent, in my view, on the housing sector. And then to me, the question is, over the next year, does China introduce policies that get a bit more growth by helping the household sector, helping retail sales, building up a more vibrant services sector, in a sense converging a little bit with the economic structure of the United States or Europe, where most activity is household services consumption and people selling services to each other? Or does China find the easiest way out just a boom in exports? On the more structural level, if China's takes the you're either fully with us or you're fully against us view, the US is going to be more fully against than fully for. And I don't think you can roll back and return to the pre-Trump trade war, pre-chip wars, pre-Huawei restrictions world.
Yeah.
But if China takes a more nuanced approach, where we're in a world of managed strategic competition, and in a world where some parts of trade will be heavily managed and other parts will be relatively open, and everybody can sort of recognize that that's the framework, and then you will debate the boundaries rather than debating, are you with us or against us? Remember that Trump's going in position, if Trump's the nominee, is he is fully against China and wants a full decoupling, which would settle the question.
I think what you're picking up on something Sun said as well, this compartmentalization, is that possible and what does that look like? So something we'll look at closely. Nargiza.
So let me maybe bucket this in three different ways. One, on the kind of the long-term structural side, I agree completely with Brad, and I think that we've been long pointing to the fact that China's economy is also on a long-term slowdown trajectory because it hasn't addressed a lot of these critical structural problems in its economy. And so far, we haven't seen indications that it's taking meaningful steps to do that. And there's a big, important caveat to all of that. If they decide tomorrow, we're going full back to a robust, aggressive reform, they're still going to go slowly, right? Because the pain of adjustment is going to be very high. And the longer you kick the can down the road, the worse it becomes, right? So that's something to think about. In the short term, for this year in China Pathfinder, we make some modest predictions for where the government could go if they decide to take moderate steps, sort of some small adjustments to help improve the economy a little bit. And one of the ones I'm particularly interested in is how they manage the local government debt situation, right? We know how important local governments are to China's economy, to how they propagate stimulus through the economy, to how they fund and pay for all these important obligations, right? So how they manage that debt issue is going to be critically important and speaks a lot about the central and local relationships. And then finally, kind of maybe zooming out and looking at the big kind of geoeconomic, geopolitical side of things. Fortunately for us, the European Commission decided to click the calendar today. Well, we're looking at a 12-month timeline. I fully expect for us to be talking about this aspect of it, right? This friction that is now happening between China and one of the last, very, very open economic partners that it has, European Union. The tension with the United States is sometimes drawn very starkly, but if China decides to take the same perspective of compartmentalizing or bundling vis-a-vis the European Union, that's going to make things much more complicated, right? Because we do see a great degree of transatlantic alignment in a lot of these perspectives. Usually the United States is a little bit more forward-leaning than the European Commission, let's say. But this issue, the sort of the desire to focus on specific technology, specific sectors, talk about the trade deficit, right? Those are all going to be with us, and we'll observe how the resolution unfolds.
I agree with you completely on the timing. This will set up very nicely for Pathfinder 4.
How good of them.
Next, yeah, that's very nice of the Europeans. Yeah. We appreciate it. Sun, over to you.
I think the local government debt will be a huge issue for China, for sure. But a bigger issue is which should be the priority for the top leadership. growth or national security, I think. Because for now, a lot of officials on the ground were a bit unsure about which area to focus on. If you put focus on growth, you should liberalize the economy more, right? You should encourage private capital to enter all kinds of areas that are now dominated by the state sector. You should also allow farmers to grow whatever they want. But in reality, right, farmers are facing more restrictions in a sense that they can only grow corn or rice instead of flowers or other more profitable produce. And on the other hand, foreign companies are facing various kinds of restrictions as to what they can invest in China or what they can purchase in China. And at the same time, I think, in a sense, I think on the top level, there's still a lack of consensus on how best to stimulate the economy. For example, as Brad just mentioned, China still has scope in launching some kind of fiscal stimulus. But from what I can gather from policy insiders in Beijing, there's always this concern of, say, if we hand out 1,000 RMB to 1.4 billion Chinese people, first of all, China doesn't have so much money. Secondly, maybe people won't spend so much money. Thirdly, maybe this will only end up creating more lazy people who don't want to work. So there's all kinds of sort of restrictions or concerns that the authority is facing as to how best to stimulate the economy, which caused some policymakers to think that maybe the economy right now is okay. We are on our track to achieve 5% growth this year, and it's okay for us to tolerate lower growth as long as the growth is of high quality. So that's, I think, the real challenge facing Beijing, in a sense that how do we what kind of growth are we really want to pursue, and what would be the right path, as Dan just mentioned.
Sun, thank you. I think you hit on this idea that we're trying to come back to today, which is there are no easy fixes, but also China's economic trajectory is more complicated than is sometimes presented in Washington. Yes, it is a significant slowdown. No, it is not falling off a cliff, and Chinese policymakers are trying to address those same issues at the same time. How much to course correct, and because there's no easy options to actually course correct. Dan, final word to you.
Yeah, well, looking ahead to 1 year from today, Josh, I think if we look at the cyclical story, given the severity of the property sector downturn, the mother of all corrections, really, cyclically, a year from now, it's going to be a little bit stronger because we're getting to the bottom of the property cycle, and there's going to be some recovery of that huge source of headwinds that China's been dealing with last year and this year. Structurally, though, and this is the most important message for Pathfinder overall, right? Yes, tactically, pay attention to those cyclical stories, but in making strategy and thinking about what's going to work for the long run, we have to keep our eye on some sort of structural framework to understand what the potential speed limits are here and what that portends for us. So structurally, there's no getting away from the lower parameters of Chinese potential growth, and that'll very much be true a year from now for the reasons which our colleagues here have pointed to. Local government finance bailout will be even more acute a year from now. On the net export side, that was really the bright spot in China's growth, such as it was in 2023. But I really don't see how 2024 is not the year when China's room to solve its problems through exports gets further constrained, much more constrained, as Nargiza said. By then, we'll know where the European Union is going on this. So we have the sort of push me, pull you of cyclical and structural there, and the ultimate factor, I think, the wild card comes down, as Sun said, to does political China decide to prioritize reform to get growth going, or national security to maintain stability at a challenging time? I think we have to look in the rearview mirror and say 2022, 2023, both years, if we're being honest about the data, the United States grew faster than China, extraordinarily, given our different levels of development, right? that will probably happen again if we manage to maintain a normal democratic government in the United States. So we kind of, the way you set it up was, what does this Chinese performance mean for the elections? At the same time, the outlook for the elections may have an effect on whether China does the hard thing and gets back to reform. If they've got more U.S. selective industrial policy, strengthening and shoring up parts of the, the U.S. is attracting huge amounts of global direct investment right now. A lot of excitement. In this quarter, we're growing probably in the 5s or something like that. A lot of good stuff, a lot of problems as well. So the expectation of where the U.S. is going is going to have a big effect, I think, on what Xi Jinping and the Communist Party think the best options are for China as well.
So much of what you just said would have been shocking to hear 3 or 4 years ago.
True.
And I think it speaks to the reason we do this and track it year over year and what we can learn year over year, not just from a quarter of data, but from 4 years that we'll have by the end of next year of looking at this. Dan, thank you. Brad, Nargiza, Sun. I want to thank everyone at Rhodium Group and the Atlantic Council who have been involved in this project over the course of a year. And I want to thank 2 people in particular who are not here on stage, Rachel Litzo of Rhodium Group and Niels Graham of the Atlantic Council. I said at the beginning this is a year-long project. These are the people that work behind the scenes over the course of 12 months to bring this to life. It is extraordinarily painstaking and difficult. We care so much about accuracy, both at Rhodium Group and the Atlantic Council. Hats off to them. We wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you for engaging on this work. Check it out at chinapathfinder.org.